Hello. Hello.
Hello, sir.
Oh, I'm good. Okay. Research person join করেননি মনে হয় না? আচ্ছা ঠিক আছে ওকে Good afternoon, everybody. Respected or distinguished resource person, honorable dignitaries, dear colleague, research scholar, participant, beloved organizing committee convener, program coordinator, and affectionate students. It is really a great pleasure and privilege to be present in the national webinars organized by the Department of English in collaboration with IQAC. Being the head of the institute, I must congratulate the teachers of the Department of English, especially Professor Saptaporna Saha and Professor Sunandita Sarkar, as they have taken initiative to organize the national webinar. First of all, I, on behalf of Institute, must welcome the respected research person, Dr. Avishek Parui, Assistant Professor, Department of Humanities and Social Science, IIT Madras. I would be immensely grateful as he has responded to our invitation despite his busy schedule. I convey my best wishes to our governing body president and all governing body members to organize the national webinar. I freely and frankly express my pleasure that we have got some highly energetic and enthusiastic faculty members, and they have been trying their level best to organize various thought-provoking seminars on the virtual platform. I do hope that our participants would reap a sound harvest from the day's discussion. I firmly believe that the day's discussion will be interesting and interactive one. The survey of the day's speech and reciprocal discussion, I do hope, would further illumine the minds of the teachers and taught. I wish a warm success of the day's webinar. Once again, thanking you all.
Thank you very much. Am I audible?
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you very much for the very kind introduction and for the invitation to this very well-conceived webinar series. I'm very delighted to be a part of it. So in this particular session, I'll be talking about memory studies and also pointing out the research possibilities that one may have from this kind of a research area. And as was pointed out in the introduction, I do supervise PhD projects on memory studies as well as medical humanities. And so what I'm going to do in this session is pitch the idea of memory studies. And what is memory studies? What do we do in memory studies? And what are the various possibilities that one might have from a research in this area? Now, so first things first, what I would like to say, I'll start the story. And this is a story that I often say through all kinds of discussion on memory studies. And this is something which really happened. It's not really a story, it's an anecdote which happened to me, which I think is quite political in quality and which has some relevance in terms of how we are to understand this whole business, as it were, of memory studies. So last year, my colleague, Dr. Merin Simiraj, and I, we organized a conference in IIT Madras, which was the first annual conference on memory studies. And we are hoping to have a center for memory studies in IIT Madras soon. We have 6 PhD students working on this area. So we hope to establish a formal center soon. Anyway, so we had this conference on memory studies last year, the first annual conference, which was themed on Jallianwala Bagh, because it was a centenary year, 100 year of Jallianwala Bagh massacre, the Amritsar massacre, which happened in 1919. Now, interestingly, I remember I have a very funny, not a funny, it's a dark humorous story about this particular event. Now, way back in 2012, when I was in my PhD in Durham, as was pointed out during the introduction, I had a series of very good friends. Some of them very liberal, white British people, very liberal, very critical of imperialism, very critical of the ills of imperialism, and obviously very, very keen to have a dialogue with the Indian of my generation in terms of the impact on imperialism, of imperialism. And I remember one particular incident where one of those friends wanted to watch a film, a Bollywood film. So I recommended a film called Rang De Basanti, which I'm sure is quite familiar to most of the participants. So we started watching the film Rang De Basanti, and then in one particular scene, if you remember, those of you who've seen the film would know, in one particular scene, there's a depiction of Jallianwala Bagh massacre, which is sort of shown in black and white to portray the grotesque quality of the event, right? It's slowed down black and white depiction of what happened in Jallianwala Bagh. So this friend of mine, I'm not going to name him, obviously, this friend of mine, otherwise very liberal, very white, very, very open and very critical of imperialism, he began to get more and more uneasy in looking at that scene, the Jallianwala Bagh massacre scene in the film Rang De Basanti. And at some point, he actually got up, paused the movie, and asked me, well, I am sure imperialism was a terrible thing. It did lots of really devastating things in India and also in the subcontinent. But this incident, Jallianwala Bagh massacre, the way it is shown in this film, did it really happen? Did it really take place? Now, it was my turn to be surprised, very, very surprised, because here was an otherwise very well-read, very well-traveled, very liberal, very critical of imperialism, very left-wing person from Britain, apparently with no idea about the Jallianwala Bagh massacre. He had never heard of it, and he obviously was seeing it for the first time. This was his first encounter, shall we say, with that particular event. So I asked him very bluntly, so you don't quite know that this event took place? There was a person called General Dyer, and he ordered firing instructions to a very, very peaceful procession in Amritsar, as a result of which thousands of people got killed, innocent people, civilians, women, children, everyone was shot at indiscriminately. It's one of the bloodiest events in imperialism. So you don't know, you have no knowledge of it? And well, he said, no, but I've never heard of it because it's never taught to us in our history textbooks. And that was a moment of epiphany for me, because you realize in some sense that a large part of history as we consume it, a large part of historical knowledge as we consume it, comes to us through textbooks. So there's a textual quality of a consumption of knowledge, in the way we consume knowledge, in the way we disseminate knowledge. So, every nation, and Britain obviously is no exception, every nation will have its bias, its historical bias in terms of how the history of the particular nation will be depicted, will be shown, will be constructed and consumed. And in terms of selecting certain events and erasing certain events, I mean, that politics of inclusion and exclusion is exactly what we want to do in memory studies. So in other words, the irony of memory studies is that we are actually more interested in forgetting rather than memory. We are more interested in pointing out or to tease out what gets forgotten, or rather how and why are certain events forgotten. So what are the politics of forgetting? So in other words, we're looking at forgetting not as a passive inability. We're looking at forgetting as an active ability. Forgetting is something which is decided upon. There's a certain sense of agency associated with forgetting. So, it's a choice. Certain events are forgotten quite deliberately, erased from national history, erased from monuments, erased from any kind of textual dissemination, etc. And of course, we can think of many examples. I just pick Britain because, imperialism is such a hot topic. We can think of many examples. Almost every country in the world will have certain events which will never be commemorated, which will never be remembered in public discourse, whereas certain events will be endlessly remembered. So again, we have this politics of privilege associated with certain events which are endlessly replayed and consumed, and certain events which are obviously forgotten and are pushed into oblivion. So oblivion is a very big deal in memory studies. So at the very outset, I would just like to point out that we in memory studies, and this is something we do with some scientists and also some people who are interested in technology, we are interested in erasure. Certain information that gets erased, and why do certain information get erased? And what's the politics of erasure? Why are certain events not commemorated? Now, at the very outset, I'd like to point out a very interesting essay that I find quite useful in terms of memory studies, and that essay is called Oblivion, appropriately enough. It's by a philosopher called Mark Auge, A-U-G-E, M-A-R-C, A-U-G-E. So I should say at this moment that I'm happy to take questions in the end, but if anyone's interested in a lengthier discussion on memory studies, feel free to email me, and I'll be happy to email you back with references on this topic if you wish. So Mark Auge's essay, Oblivion, is a fascinating work And it's actually talking about the politics of oblivion from different perspectives. So there's obviously the psychological perspective, things are forgotten in the human mind, in the human brain, but also it extends into a more macro perspective, shall we say, a more cultural perspective. So why do certain events get forgotten? Now, what Oj is saying in that essay is something that we know from neuroscientists today, from psychologists today, and that's a very interesting inference, and that is the following. The forgetting is not really the opposite of remembering. And this is something that I'm going to reiterate over and over again. Forgetting is not really the ontological opposite of remembering. Rather, forgetting is a cognitive component of remembering. In other words, if we are to remember something, we must be able to forget. Right. So again, forgetting becomes a very important component. So if you're remembering something, you are simultaneously unremembering something at the same time. So remembering and unremembering happen simultaneously in a very hardcore neuroscientific, psychological way. And I'm going to talk a little bit about neuroscience as well, because we draw a lot on neuroscience as well as cultural studies in terms of looking at memory as a micro neural activity as well as a macro cultural activity. So in both domains, forgetting and remembering happen together simultaneously. So it's not really an ontological opposite. Forgetting and remembering sort of pitched against each other. Forgetting and remembering are actually cognitive components of each other, connected categories, connected cognitive categories. In other words, as I mentioned, if you are to remember, you must be able to forget. Right, and we also know through neuroscience today, some of the most acclaimed neuroscientists, such as Eric Kandel, ERICKANDL, Eric Kandel, Joseph Ledoux, Antonio Damasio, and we can name quite a few more. And again, I'm happy to give references to people who are emailing me about them. So, these people are actually telling us quite clearly that, when you remember something, any incident, the whole idea of total recall is a myth. Because memory, the very process of remembering, has incompletion and cognitive bias embedded in it, right? So cognitive bias. So there's a certain bias. The brain is a very biased machine. All the brain is a very biased machine. We're hardwired to be biased, right? So we have a color bias. We have a emotion bias. So if you remember something, you're also forgetting something. So because the brain must forget, right? So the cognitive bias is very, very important. And any act of recall. So there's no such thing as total recall. Every recall is an incomplete recall. So what happens essentially is, so people like Eric Kandel, so this fascinating book is written called Memory from Mind to Molecules. I do recommend it quite heavily. So people like us, people are not really scientists, but would like to know more about how the science of memory works. So that book, From Memory, Memory from Mind to Molecules, he says quite clearly that when we're remembering something, we're also imagining certain things. So imagination and remembrance go simultaneously, because there are always this missing links, there's little gaps in the entire recall process, which are never filled in, and we can only fill that in with imagination. Right? So imagination plays a very important part in the process of remembrance, because as I mentioned, remembrance and forgetting happen simultaneously. So if it happens simultaneously, there are certain missing links, and that's where imagination comes in. And we can have extreme examples where the imagination becomes more important than memory. The imagination becomes more a bigger cognitive component than memory. In cases of amnesia, in cases of Alzheimer, in cases of other kinds of mental illness, where imagination becomes more important, where people remember things purely through imagination. But that's obviously an extreme example of imagination through memory. But even in quote-unquote normative processes of remembrance, imagination plays a very key cognitive component. Right? Now, the moment we hear this, that imagination becomes a very it's embedded in the whole process of memory. Imagination is a cognitive component of memory. Forgetting is a cognitive component of memory. We obviously begin to see the connecting links to literature. Because even in literature, any act of narration in literature, especially if we look at postmodern narration, unreliability, incompletion, bias, these become very important components in narrativity. So the whole process of narrativity. So that itself contains bias, cognitive bias, incompletion, fractured fault lines, etc. So we see any act of storytelling in literature. And I'm going to use a few literary references, a few literary texts, which are hopefully familiar to most of us today, in terms of looking at how storytelling and remembrance are actually very connected categories, right? So the way literature operates, storytelling, points of view, perspective, bias, we find that particular mechanism of narration is actually quite closely connected to the way the human brain operates, the human mind, recalls something, right? As I mentioned, every after recall is an incomplete recall, and it entails forgetting, it entails imagination, it always includes imagination as a very core cognitive process, right? So certainly we see something like the classic postmodernist unreliable narration. It certainly becomes a very important trope, shall we say, in memory studies, because all acts of memory, all acts of remembrance are unreliable. And that's what even scientists tell us today. That when remembering something, every act of remembrance is unreliable in quality. It depends on the perspective of the particular mind. So the human neurons, the brains, they're all hardwired to be incomplete, to be biased in quality. Right, so we have this immediate connection between unreliable narration and recall, because as I mentioned, recall entails forgetting, recall entails fractured fault lines, and recall entails imaginative insertions. So we have this immediate cognitive connections with literature coming in. Now, there's a very funny story. Again, every time I use the word funny in this session, please assume I'm talking about dark humor, and not funny in an unproblematic way. It's funny in a problematic way. So it is a funny story by Borges, and it is called Funes the Memorious. Again, it might be familiar to some of us here attending the session. So that particular story of Funes, F-U-N-E-S, Funes the Memorious, obviously written in Spanish originally, but it is obviously, it's also available in English translation. It is readily available in the internet. So do download it and have a read. So in that story, Funes the Memorious, we have a boy called Funes, and there's a very simple boy, and he's a countryside boy, and falls from a horse and gets injured on the head. And this disease that develops is that he cannot forget, right? And this is it's almost become a case study for neuroscientists today. There are people who have actually written papers on this story saying this is actually empirically true. And the particular story, we see a boy who cannot forget anymore. And his inability to forget becomes a pathological condition. The inability to forget becomes a medical condition. And this is interesting because what Borges is saying through the story is that forgetting is a very healthy cognitive thing. And if you're not able to forget anymore, that becomes an illness as well. That becomes a problem. That becomes a pathology in some sense. Right? So forgetting becomes a very healthy mechanism of remembering. And not just remembering in a way we navigate with the world. So we find that what happens in the story is the boy's embodiment becomes interrupted. And I use the word embodiment in a very complex way. I use the word embodiment as a neural category, as a neural phenomenon, the way neurons process information, but also embodiment in the way that the self processes information from its surroundings. So there is this embedded quality about embodiment, which is neural quality, it's inside the body. There's also equally an extended quality about embodiment in the sense that the self extends in an intersubjective economy of matter, metaphor, and discourses in the way it navigates to the environment around it. Now you find in that particular story, when a boy is not able to forget anymore, he suffers from what I would like to classify as interrupted embodiment, in the sense that his navigation with the world begins to get interrupted, increasingly interrupted. And interestingly, this is why it becomes really scientific. His ability for abstractions begin to fade away. It begins to sort of deplete, as it were. So he remembers everything. He remembers dates, he remembers figures, he remembers numbers perfectly. But his ability to empathize, his ability to form abstractions, abstract feelings, those begin to suffer. Right. So again, we're looking at forgetting as a very human cognitive activity. So you find that there's different connections between abstractions, empathy, kindness. These are very, very human categories. These begin to get suffered. These begin to get depleted when the ability to forget goes away. So we are back to this very interesting idea of forgetting as an ability, of forgetting as an agentic ability. The self is able to forget, right? The brain is able to forget. So in that particular story, the brain's ability to forget disappears, right? So that becomes a problem. So I do recommend the story. Those of you who want to mediated through economy, it's mediated through culture, etc. So even something as psychological as trauma, even something as neural as trauma, we find how these are culturally mediated, racially mediated. I'll just give two examples to corroborate this point. So, the moment we say we work in memory studies trauma, the automatic assumption is that for most people assume that we have decided we are working with the Holocaust, and that's obviously the trauma industry in academia. The Holocaust, the genocide of Nazis, the very terrible tragedy suffered by the Jews, as a result of which close to 6 million Jews were killed in a very systematic process. It was the Second World War. But so that becomes the hegemonic idea of trauma in academia, the hegemonic understanding of trauma suffered by a particular demography. And that becomes, obviously, as I mentioned, some kind of a trauma industry. In a sense, there are endless books and films and movies and literary texts and research articles on that particular event, which is obviously a terrible human tragedy. And this is where it begins to get problematic. Around the same time as when the Holocaust happened, which is around 1941. So we had something very similar happening very close to our place, very close to India, very close to our home. I mean, I'm assuming most of the listeners are from West Bengal. So we had something terrible called the Bengal Famine, right? And very little is read about that, very little is written about that. Close to 3 million people died in the Bengal Famine. And that happened around, again, the early decades, the early time in 1940s. 1941 is exactly where that took place, when that took place. And even by official estimates, close to 3 million people were killed by the Bengal Famine, right? And as some economists, more and more economists are telling us today, and we have some friends who have written papers on the Bengal Famine, some very, very respected economics, and we know today that that famine was actually engineered. It was almost a man-made famine. The British just stopped the supplies because they wanted to save the supplies for the Second World War to feed the soldiers, as a result of which it was just a very, very badly handled supply management exercise, as a result of which the famine happened. So it wasn't really a natural catastrophe. It was actually a man-made catastrophe, as a result of which close to 3 million people died in Bengal, the Bengal province at that particular point in time, where just imagine going to England today and talking to a very well-educated, generally educated British person about the Bengal Famine. I mean, they don't even know the Jallianwala massacre. Forget about the Bengal Famine. So again, what I'm trying to say is there are certain events which become privileged events in terms of how they're remembered over and over again. And this politics of privilege are obviously informed by economy, informed by race, informed by different cultural associations. So the Bengal Famine affected poor Bengali people at that point in time. So who would be interested to know about that around that time? In fact, there's a report that Winston Churchill, who went on to win a Nobel Prize in Peace, ironically, where he was informed that people are dying in the streets of Calcutta. People are dying with animals. There are vultures in the streets of Calcutta. The animals eating each other. People are close to eating each other. Should we release the supplies? Should we free the people a little bit? Should we release the food supplies, the grain supplies? And apparently Churchill's response was, well, if it's so bad in Bengal, how is it that Gandhi is still alive? So let Gandhi die first, and then we'll release the supplies. So we can see the extent to which this was man-made, the Bengal Famine, which was happening exactly the same time as the Holocaust. But there's hardly any research on it. There's hardly any academic attention on it. There's hardly any cultural attention on it. I mean, I personally don't know a single film made on the Bengal Famine. And any random person can name a dozen films on the Holocaust. Right? So the point I'm trying to say is I'm not trying to compare the two tragedies. I'm not saying one is more tragic than the others. But the point is, how is it and why is it that one particular event gets remembered and replayed over and over again, different discursive networks, whereas the same event, a very similar event around the same time, gets hardly any attention, any academic attention, any social attention, any popular culture attention, right? So the point is, there are certain events which are forgotten, there are certain events which are remembered, and the politics of forgetting and remembering, they are informed by different kinds of discursive formations, different discursive investments, which are racial, which are economic, which are cultural inequality, right? So even at a very micro neural level, forgetting is not an innocent activity. The brain is always playing tricks on the cell in terms of what the brain decides to forget and what the brain decides to not forget. Equally, forgetting as a cultural phenomenon is a profoundly political activity. It's not an innocent activity at all. So what gets forgotten is almost always politically informed. And what gets remembered over and over again is obviously the right kind of memory, the hegemonic narrative, which is obviously compatible to any nationalist history, to any nationalist narrative, or glorification of nationalism, etc. So we can think of any example of any nation in the world which will have a certain hegemonic version of history. And then obviously there are oral narratives which are more embarrassing in quality, so which don't really have that kind of academic attention. Right, so for example, to the longest time, there was no partition museum in India. I have a friend, Aninda Rai Chaudhary, who works in the University of St. Andrews, and he's written a wonderful paper, and I'm happy to send the paper to you if anyone's interested. He's written on the absence of the museum about the partition. It's only very recently that we have a museum in the Wagah border. It's probably come up in 2014 or 15, if I'm not mistaken. Now, one of the reasons why that there was no museum at all during partition is because the state, the Indian national state or the Pakistan national state, was quite complicit with the violence of partition. So for the state to erect a museum in an act of violence to which it is itself an author of would be a sort of embarrassment, a source of embarrassment. So it's not really, it doesn't really have the clinical distance from the event. It is quite complicit with the event because the very formation of the state happened through the act of violence. So to have a museum on partition where the different sites of violence, the different markers of violence, the different markers of trauma and loss will be displayed was a sense of embarrassment for both the states, nations, India and Pakistan. So for the longest time, there's no museum on partition at all. So again, museum, as all of you would know, is a very political space. The archive is a very political space. So what gets into the archive and what is excluded from the archive is obviously a political decision. Right, so both in its macro version, the cultural version, the political version, memory entails inclusion and exclusion, and inclusion and exclusion are entangled together in very political ways. And also in the micro version, in the sense that the human brain remembers, inclusion and exclusion are again that depend on the cognitive bias of the remembering self. Right now, one novel that I find very useful, and the book that was mentioned that I'm writing on the moment, Culture, Literary, Matter, Metaphor, Memory, the second chapter is exactly on this. And hopefully it will be out next year from Roman Littlefield. But I'm talking about the whole idea of how the brain remembers and how the state remembers. So whether there can be any connection between the two. And I'm looking at the fault lines between what the human subject remembers and what the state remembers, right? The incompatibility between two different kinds of memory, two different narratives of memory as well. And obviously we can think of any number of examples. For the purpose of my book, I'm using two texts, and I'm hoping both are familiar to most of the people attending this. So one is Salar Hassan Manto's short story, Toba Tek Singh, which I'm hoping most of you would have read. That is entirely about the incompatibility of two different narratives of memory. So we have in that story, two new nation narratives are being formed, India and Pakistan. And in that formation, the two grand narratives of two nations, the small narratives, little narratives are getting erased away. So again, we have a very interesting example between the entanglement between memory and space. So the space of Toba Tek Singh, the village of Toba Tek Singh, quite literally disappears as the big grand narratives of India and Pakistan come into being, because no one quite knows what Toba Tek Singh is, and no one's interested to know what Toba Tek Singh is. That just becomes a disappeared space, right? But for one particular person, Bidhan Singh, in that particular story, that is the only space which matters to him, right? So everything takes place for him in that particular territory, Toba Tek Singh. So, you know, every time he meets someone, and everyone's talking about India and Pakistan, everyone's talking about the partition, and, you know, that story is obviously a parody of partition. It's a magnificent parody of partition, Toba Tek Singh. And it's sort of done in a very mathematical, blunt way, a very vulgar, blunt way, where if you're a Hindu, you're sent back from Pakistan to India, from Karachi, Lahore to India. And if you're a Muslim, you send from India to Pakistan. So it's a very mathematical kind of a division, very symmetrically done, that completely ignores the human complexity of location. Now we have one person, Toba Tek Singh, or Bidhan Singh, who's from a village called Toba Tek Singh, and he wants to just go back to the village. But obviously no one knows what the village is, because amidst all the grand narratives, several villages have disappeared. And we can find it very relatable to some of the geopolitical tensions happening with our borders today in India and also elsewhere. Right now, that village disappears, so he doesn't want to go to India and Pakistan. And quite literally and quite symbolically, the story ends with a no man's land. If you remember the story, he refused to go to India. He just stands in no man's land, the liminal territory, the liminal landscape between two classified territories, and that's where the story ends. So that space between two zones is exactly the liminality of memory, right? So it's the liminal landscape between two categories, between two classified categories. It's between memory and forgetting. It's a twilight zone. And twilight, obviously, is a very important category in memory studies. It is existential in quality, but also quite discursive in quality, right? So twilight is the time space between two zones. It's the space of becoming and re-becoming. So that becomes the twilight territory, the liminal territory, where, it doesn't go to any of the classified zones. It doesn't go to India. It doesn't go to Pakistan. It dies in no man's land. So that becomes the liminality of memory, between memory and forgetting. So that particular story by Montoya is fascinating. I mean, I keep going back to it in terms of looking at how the complexity of human memory actually undercuts the bluntness of nationalist memory. So we have this grand narrative of nationalist memory, which is playing out in an overarching space, and against which we have this resistance that the human brain has. One particular brain, one particular mind, ironically the madman's mind, and that offers a resistance in terms of the refusal to forget. He doesn't want to forget Tubatek Singh. He wants to include it in his imagination. That territory must be included. Whereas the two grand narrators want to forget it and move on quite quickly. So we have this essential incompatibility between two narratives of remembering. Now, as I mentioned, the twilight territory as an existential phenomenon, as a cognitive phenomenon, one concept that I find quite useful in memory studies, and that's something I encourage my PhD scholars to do as well, is the concept of the chronotop. Again, I'm hoping it's familiar to most of the attendees over here. So chronotop is a concept by Mikhail Bakhtin, the Russian formalist, but it's a very healthy concept, it's a very handy concept, because it combines the idea of space and time. Because when we remember something, we're not only remembering a space or a time, we're remembering a compound of space and time, a capsule of space and time. It's always a space and a time put together. So if you think of something like Amitabh Ghosh's Shadow Lines, it's entirely about the chronotop. It's entirely about the space and time put together, right? And obviously, you remember a particular space, you actually thinking about a particular time. So any act of remembering is space travel as well as time travel. Right, so chronotop as a compound of space and time is a very important theoretical concept in memory studies, something which I encourage scholars to examine and investigate further. Now, the other book that I'm just going to talk a little bit about, and then I'm going to wind up the session and hopefully take some questions in the end, is a book by Milan Kundera called The Book of Laughter and Forgetting. It's about Czechoslovakia. It's about the pre-communist, communist, and post-communist Czechoslovakia, and it's also entirely about memory. It's called The Book of Laughter and Forgetting. So again, forgetting is embedded in the very title of the book, and forgetting, as we can see in that book, those of you who read it will know, is hardly an innocent activity. It's a profoundly political activity. People choose to forget, or rather, people choose to not remember, and that's the only way that you can resist dictatorship. That's the only way we can resist traumatic memory. So the traumatic memory of dictatorship, the traumatic memory of fascism, the traumatic memory of tyranny. I mean, the only way we can move on from that is by choosing to forget, is by choosing to not remember. So forgetting becomes a very complex activity in memory studies. So sometimes the state forgets because it wants to forget a certain shameful events in its own nationalist history. Sometimes certain democracies forget because they want to forget and move on, but don't want to remember the traumatic memory. So, we can think of any number of examples. So, for example, very close to West Bengal, we have the example of the Morichapi massacre, something which happened during the partition, in the Bangladesh partition, when the immigrants, the migrants, we have a lot of politics and migrant workers today. And again, the whole politics of exile, the whole politics of immigrants, the whole politics of migrants, and migration becomes a very profound concept in memory studies. So the Morichapi massacre is a forgotten history in the history of West Bengal. I mean, obviously, none of us growing up in West Bengal would read that in our history books, because that's an event in which a state played a part in an act of violence. It was state-ordered violence, a state-ordered massacre. And if you read The Hungry Tide, for example, by Amitabh Ghosh, there's a reference to that massacre. And as there's some scholarship on Morichapi massacre which has come up recently. If you read, for example, among fiction, Shunil Bandopadaya's Uber Question contains a massacre as well. Right, so the character Harit Mondal in that particular novel, it contains a massacre. It becomes an embodiment of that massacre. But the point is, that massacre is not really a chosen historical event to be consumed through historical textbooks. So again, it's a forgotten incident. It must be forgotten as dictated by the state. So forgetting, and I'm beginning to wind up now, forgetting becomes a profoundly political and discursive activity in terms of how it plays out in cultural associations and cultural territories, but also in a way how the brain decides to forget, or the brain decides to not remember. right? Now, I'm just going to wind up with a final reference to another text, which is, again, quite familiar, I'm hoping, to most of the attendees, and that's the graphic novel Mouse by Art Spiegelman. It's obviously about the Holocaust, and you can't really ignore the Holocaust in a memory study session. It will creep in at some point. So anyway, so it's about the Holocaust. It's about a graphic novelist, Art Spiegelman, who wants to write a novel about the Holocaust. He goes to his father, and he goes to his daddy to ask him about, in terms of, what the Holocaust was. He wants to know the story about the Holocaust, but obviously he receives a lot of silence from his father because his father decides to not narrate the story. So the entire graphic novel, Mouse, is about the failure of writing a graphic novel. He cannot convert the traumatic memory into a narrative memory. And this refusal to convert a traumatic memory into narrative memory, that refusal is obviously connected to a sense of political agency, to a sense of existential agency. The only way we can move on from trauma is by not remembering it. So Vladek, who was the father figure in a particular graphic novel, he would not tell his son about what really took place. So he gives a very unreliable narration. He messes up the dates. And there's a very interesting story, a very interesting scene in that particular graphic novel where Artie finds out that his mother apparently had written a diary chronicling the days in the concentration camp. And obviously, for someone like him writing a story about it, he's a post-memory generation. Post-memory obviously means that a generation which consumes trauma by reading about it. It hasn't really lived through the trauma, but it has read about it. So he's a second-generation Jew in America. So he's a post-memory generation. He has consumed the trauma through reading and listening to his parents and grandparents about it. So he wants to find a diary that his mother had written chronicling the trauma. And then he finds out that his father had burned the diary because his father didn't want the diary to be read again because that would be too traumatic for him. So he wants a critical distance. He wants an existential distance from that traumatic site. So, that the burning of the diary becomes a very symbolic burning. It almost becomes an example of epistemic violence in some sense. You're burning the knowledge of the trauma. So epistemic violence, obviously, the violence on the level of knowledge. So Artie, the second-generation Jew, the post-memory Jew, will never have access to the real site of trauma because that diary has been burned. And that burning of the diary becomes a very symbolic act in some sense. So just to wind up, and I did give some references to some neuroscientists. So just to wind up, the two people that I'm very interested in, two people in neuroscience are very interested in, Joseph Ledoux, I mentioned this. It's got a brilliant book called A Synaptic Self, and also the emotional brain. So the synaptic self is the one I'm going to talk a little bit, and then I'm going to close the session. So in that particular book, Synaptic Self, he talks about how memory obviously goes on to a process of encoding. So you encode information, the brain encodes information neurally. But interestingly, this is a funny bit. And again, when I say funny, please attach a darkness to it. It's darkly funny. So memory is what happens not in the neurons, but what happens between the neurons. So the synapses are the sites between the neurons. So memory is a process through which information passes from one neuron to another neuron. And that site, that interstitial site, that liminal site, that twilight site between two neurons is what scientists tell us today is a site when memory happens. So it's a process of becoming, unbecoming, and rebecoming. It's quite literally a deconstructionist in activity, right? So the synapse, or the site between the two neurons, is where the memory negotiation takes place. And Ledoux has a fascinating example, a model of memory. It's called the reconsolidation model of memory. Again, I'm happy to engage and lend the emails about it if someone wants more references. So according to the reconsolidation model of memory, what he says is, when we remember a particular event, we don't really remember the original memory of it. We remember the last remembered version of it. Okay, I'll say it again. When we remember a particular event, we don't remember the original event. We don't remember the original memory of that particular event. What you do remember instead is the last remembered version. So every act of remembering is also an act of slippage in some sense. It's so Derridian when you think about it, so post-structuralist when you think about it. Because every act of remembering a particular event is a slipping away from that particular event. You're adding things, you're imagining things, you're forgetting things, because that's a very natural cognitive process. Right now, one person that I find fascinating in terms of connecting this very deconstructionist neuroscientific version of memory and critical theory, especially in the way it looks at trauma, is a person called Catherine Malabou. Now, Catherine Malabou is a Derridian scholar who is a very, very fierce critique of Freud. So she does this fascinating feminist post-structuralist take on Freud, but she is also interesting in terms of how she takes this notion of plasticity, or synaptic plasticity that people are Ledoux talk about, and sort of imports that into critical theory, right? In terms of how we are our plastic selves. So we are constantly plastic. There's a performative quality in terms of how we remember. And she talks about trauma, she talks about accidents. So there's fascinating work that she has called The Ontology of the Accident. And I do recommend it. And there's another work that she has, it's called Plasticity at Dusk. So again, twilight, that becomes a very important territory for us. So dusk or twilight is where plasticity takes place. So the neural mechanism of the human self, which is also political, also existential, also neural. So this constant embedded extended quality of the human subject is essentially plastic in quality. So the plasticity becomes a philosophical category. And that's the one route that I find quite interesting, to take from memory studies, neuroscience, and import that, map that into literature, literary representations, and obviously other forms of representation such as cinema. And the cinema obviously is a very fertile field to look at memory studies. So just to conclude, I hope this lecture has had some interest in terms of triggering the kinds of things that we can do in memory studies from the perspective of literature. But just to conclude the session, so we are essentially what we are today is because of what we have remembered through different acts of recall, whether it's an existential act, a neural act, or it's a textual act through our textual consumption of knowledge. But equally, we are what we are because of what we have not remembered, right? So not remembering or unremembering becomes a very key and crucial cognitive activity. We must be able to unremember. We must be able to not remember. So remembering and forgetting are not ontological opposites. They're cognitive components of each other in terms of how we evolve existentially and also culturally as a demography, as an individual, and also in terms of identity. So I'll just conclude with this, and I thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to take some questions if there are any. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah, it's a very good question. Thank you. So, I have mentioned Derrida very briefly in this lecture, but there's one book by Derrida which I find, maybe I should have mentioned this when I mentioned Kundera, because when I use Kundera, I use Derrida to look at Kundera. So Derrida has got this fascinating book called Spectres of Marx. Again, I'm hoping most of you would have read it. And there he has this very interesting idea of hauntology, right? So haunted ontology, something which doesn't quite disappear. That ontic component, that ontic entity, which doesn't quite go away. And interestingly, and this is where we say yay in literary studies, because he used this example of Hamlet's father, right, as a classic example of ontology, that goes, which is not quite dead, which is not quite gone, but it's still not there. It's somewhere in the liminal territory between forgetting and remembering, between what is there and what is not there. So I think in terms of looking at traumatic memory in terms of how they resurface and how we negotiate with them, whether through narrative, whether through different kinds of recalls, whether through cultural practices, there's always this residual idea about traumatic memory. It doesn't quite disappear in that sense, right? But what's interesting is the relevance of traumatic memory in terms of how it connects to narrative memory. There's one particular psychologist that I use a lot. I mean, he's a sort of forgotten figure in memory studies. He was a contemporary of Freud. He was someone called Pierre Janet, Janet. And I've got an article on Catherine Manson's Fly, what I've drawn on trauma using Janet rather than Freud, because I think he's someone who should be remembered. How ironical. He should be resurrected in some sense, right? So Janet has this very interesting concept of traumatic memory and narrative memory. So he's saying that for a traumatic memory to become narrative memory, there must be a sense of distancing. There must be the clinical, comfortable distancing before our subject can begin to speak about it. in some sense. And we have endless examples of Holocaust literature where subjects won't speak. And I just use example of Maoist, for example, and there are other references we can think of as well. But what Jeanette is saying is, and this is something which never comes in Freud, and Freud never talks about this, and Freud talks about trauma, melancholia, mourning, and all the rest of it. But this is such an original thing. And I use this theory by Jeanette to look at Kathleen Mansfield's short stories on First World War. And the whole point is, and I believe this is what the question was, the idea of the traumatic memory never quite going away, and how that disturbs and complicates the narrative memory. So when you want to make a narrative out of it, your brain will sort of resist it to a certain extent, so that the narrative will never become a comfortable narrative. Right? So we think of, for example, the PTSD narratives, the war veterans coming back from Iraq or Vietnam or any such places and trying to tell the story and failing in the process. I mean, I use, for example, one of the early examples, I think, about PTSD fiction is Heart of Darkness, when Marlowe comes back from Congo and is unable to tell the story because he doesn't quite know how to put that in classic realism. Right? He has a very fractured storytelling mode. He's messing up all the time because the traumatic memory is never quite gone. It's ontological in a Derridian sense. It's somewhere there. So the idea of the traumatic memory never quite going away and complicating narrative memory in terms of how that resists and complicates and staggers the idea of storytelling. And in this book that I'm writing, I'm using the reference of staggered storytelling. I mean, clumsy storytelling, right? So the clumsy storytelling comes to the idea of that exactly that word was mentioned in the question, that the ontological quality is never quite gone. Now, if you read Kundera, we find that ontological quality extends into architecture. So if we look at the Prague of Kundera, the Book of Laughter and Forgetting, we have these old communist buildings which have been renamed into new government buildings, but there are certain bits and pieces which remind people of the older communist era. And again, that's profoundly ontological. It's never quite gone. It's that liminal twilight territory between becoming and unbecoming. So yes, and just to end up the response to the question, I think, again, I mentioned Malibu. So if you read Plasticity at Dusk by Malibu, which is a very post-structuralist take on trauma, she talks about exactly that that trauma which doesn't go away. And what happens if you take the trauma and try to put that into a narrative? That becomes a very complicated narrative. So classic realism doesn't work, as we see in Heart of Darkness. So we end up having more extreme examples of narration like magic realism, etc. Yes, thank you. Yeah, every question needs to have a pandemic literature now. Yes, well, memory studies quite literally, it has a very clinical component. I'm more interested in the cognitive component, obviously. I'm not a trained clinical person, but there's obviously this very clinical component from memory studies in terms of looking at amnesia, Alzheimer, and different kinds of narrations. So yes, my answer to that question would be a very, very strong affirmative. And I have a PhD scholar who's working on that at the moment, looking at the clinical quality of cognition, and not the cognitive quality of memory, but the clinical quality of memory in terms of how memory loss can become very interesting. But I think this question is interesting because it connects to the pandemic today. So, for example, all of us will have a collective memory. I mean, assuming we survive this, fingers crossed. If we do survive, we'll have a collective memory about this particular pandemic. But at the same time, each memory will be different. Each subject will have a different location in that collective memory. So we'll have a very interesting example of a collective chronotop of having survived this pandemic together. Obviously, I'm being very optimistic, but also this private chronotops, where you have this private negotiations with the overarching narrative of the pandemic. Right? So this pandemic is obviously it's sort of spilled over into an existential domain. It's not really medical anymore. It's profoundly cultural. It's linguistic. The language has changed. There's always a before and after in this pandemic. The language will have changed. Culture obviously has already changed. The economy is changed for the worse, and our negotiation in terms of social behavior will also have changed post pandemic. Right? So that will have not just medical effects, but also profound existential effects. And as I mentioned, this pandemic is a very good example. Again, good is not a good word. A very dark example, shall we say, of how the clinical and the cognitive components of memory can be merged together in terms of looking at how we inhabit this territory of sickness and I use the word territory quite literally. This is a space for sickness, and our understanding of space obviously has changed. It's suffered a degree of defamiliarization, shall we say, in terms of social distancing, in terms of social behavior. But this idea of space and time, it will have an almost Einsteinian paradigm shift post-pandemic. So yes, I would say a very strong affirmative to that question. Yeah, very seriously, very, very seriously, because as I mentioned, oral histories, the reason why we call them oral histories is because they're not really classified knowledge. And this politics of classification is interesting over here. And again, we go back to Derrida. If you read something like the archive fever, you find that the whole idea of the archive has always had to do, very etymologically speaking, with the idea of authority, with prestige. So what gets into the archive is obviously there's a prestige quotient in terms of what is classified knowledge. So the non-prestigious knowledge, the non-classified knowledge, non-hegemonic knowledge is exactly what we are more interested in memory studies, because that obviously foregrounds forgetting better than remembering. Because as I mentioned at the very outset of this lecture, that we in memory studies, and as I mentioned, we have a center, we are evolving into a center in IIT Madras, we are more interested in looking at the politics of forgetting, the experience of forgetting, the technology of forgetting. So I think oral narratives are a very fertile field to look at in terms of how forgetting becomes a very crucial component in political landscapes as well as in existential landscapes. And I think I mentioned some events, Morichapi, for example, the knowledge that is not there about Jallianwala Bagh in the current British generation, and also the Bengal Famine, events which have been conveniently forgotten and which are perhaps only available or only accessible through oral narratives. So this very binary between oral narratives and classified history is something that we need to deconstruct through memory studies. Thank you. Yes, yes, yes. Very, very good question. I think this whole idea of epistemic violence is very interesting for us in memory studies. I mean, I started my session with a half humorous anecdote about a young white person, white liberal person who has no idea, no clue about Jallianwala Bagh. And what else is that apart from epistemic violence? But he has not been, it's not his fault. I'm not saying he's a bad guy. I'm not saying he's a racist. He's otherwise a very liberal person. But I mean, he hasn't had access to that information. That information has been denied to him. So this, withdrawal of information, or this sort of closure of information, is obviously an example of epistemic violence, which can extend into cultural amnesia. And Kundera is full of that. I mean, if you read Kundera, for example, we have this intergenerational quality of amnesia. One generation remembers something, the next generation doesn't remember, because no one talks about that anymore. So the intergenerational quality of this cultural amnesia is something which Kundera offers a very fine example too. So yes, that's a very, very good question. Yeah, I mean, I've just submitted an article that's going to come out of this. It's an edited volume that Rockler just bringing out on diaspora literature. And my submission is on Srinivas Bandopadaya's Purva Question, which is about the Bangladesh, India, Bangladesh, Pakistan partition, and then before that, India-Pakistan partition, and how there are different kinds of diaspora. I mean, that novel, Purva Question, or East-West, I think English translation is also available. And I do recommend it because what that novel does, I mean, it's obviously written in Bengali, so it's not that famous, but what that novel does, it looks at the entire ontology of the diaspora in a very Derridan way, in a very deconstructed way. So, for example, for someone who grows up in Dhaka and someone who comes to Calcutta after this East Pakistan, West Pakistan divide, when Bangladesh comes into being, so when the Hindus flee from Bangladesh to India and they come to Calcutta, so Calcutta becomes a diasporic territory for that particular person in terms of linguistic otherness, in terms of cultural otherness, because the East Pakistan and Bangladesh partition was a very complicated, very complex political event, because that's where the previous partition, the idea of the previous partition being a Hindu-Muslim partition, that got slightly deconstructed, because over here it was more of a linguistic partition, right? So it was a language thing that became the more important, the big deal, shall we say. And obviously language and this kinship with culture became more important than a very blunt understanding of religious divide. So that particular book by Chunul Bandyopadhyay, East West, Who Question, is about this idea of diaspora and how we can problematize it, not just looking at East-West as geopolitical territories, but looking at something like Calcutta itself as a place which is home as well as exile for the same subject through an intergenerational process. So for a generation which comes from Dhaka to Calcutta, the first generation will have the sense of alienation, the linguistic alienation, the cultural alienation. That'll be diaspora for that particular subject. Whereas in the intergenerational process, the second and third generations will find Calcutta to be the home. And again, this nostalgia about Dhaka, the nostalgia about Bangladesh, that becomes very utopian kind of nostalgia. And I think I should have used the word nostalgia in this session as well. I mean, there are so many things I should have used, but one of the funny things about memory studies sessions, you keep forgetting things more often than you do in other sessions. But the whole idea of nostalgia is very political as well, because what do you remember is, again, a chronotop. You're remembering not just a place, you're remembering a place and a time put together. So the Dhaka that you remember is the Dhaka of the 60s, not the Dhaka of today. So when you go back today, you're obviously disappointed, right? So the whole idea of diaspora, I think, it becomes more problematized in memory studies. So I would say yes, a very strong yes to the question. And also looking at diaspora through the lenses of neuroscience, lenses of psychology, because I think this is a good time for research like this, because we have people like Eric Kandel, Joseph Ledoux, Antonio Damasio, and so many other people who are essentially an increase in looking at literature and literary studies, and also people from technology. I mean, for example, in IIT Madras, we had a session with KLM, Royal Dutch Airlines, who wanted to team up with us, my colleague Meryl Simiraj and I. We were invited to a session because they wanted to find out, the KLM Dutch Airlines, that while doing bookings, there seems to be this inherent bias, or subliminal bias. They're very good with these terms, technology people. They have this subliminal bias. So they wanted to find out if the machine remembers through bias as well. So we were invited to a session where we talked about bias as well. So the whole idea of bias, diaspora, territory, liminality, I think could be really revisited using memory studies, because this is a very naturally and organically interdisciplinary field. It draws on psychology, it draws on effect studies, it draws obviously on culture studies, and also on post-colonial theory, as the person who asked the question mentioned. So yes, thank you. Yeah, sure. Yeah, excellent question. So, I mean, river obviously is such a rich metaphor for memory. I mean, it is fluid, it's geopolitical, it flows across territories, it doesn't really sort of, it defies borders in some sense. So river is a very rich trope in memory studies in terms of the free-flowing attribute that it has. So I think my answer to that would be a very strong yes, in terms of this geopolitical markers and how the same river can have different names depending on the location and a particular geopolitical landscape. How does a river get remembered through oral storytelling, through local folklores, local legends, and how can that be contrasted with the more rigid divisions, with the more rigid classifications around these rivers that are nationalist in quality. So again, we're back to the one of the earlier questions about oral narratives. I think was pointing towards that. I believe that the whole idea of the oral narrative being the less hegemonic version. I think what we should do in memory studies is we should sort of question the ontology of hegemony, the epistemic ontology. Why should we believe something that is documented and not something which is not documented? So what the politics of documentation is obviously inflected through so many markers: race, imperialism, ideology, economy, money, etc. So the entire ontology of documentation should be questioned in memory studies. So I think the river is a very rich metaphor in terms of looking at the memory locations and also the politics of naming and the politics of chronotops, I think. So the nostalgia around the river as a free-flowing body flowing in and out, I think is a very rich metaphor. And that kind of research, I think, through oral narratives is definitely a way forward in memory studies. So yes. No, it isn't. So this is the whole thing. I mean, we cannot really have a symmetrical division that way. And that's the whole point I was trying to make. So the whole point of memory studies, and I use a phrase, and I bore my PhD scholars to death by using this phrase, and the phrase is asymmetric entanglement. And I borrow the term entanglement from quantum physics. It's a very handy term. And asymmetric entanglement is exactly that. We can't quantify the mixture. We can't sort of say this is where religion ends and language begins, right? And that's the whole point of humanities research, that we can't sort of quantify and put a number or a percentage in terms of how something overrides the other. And that's the whole point of literature. And I think this is sort of connected to the river metaphor in the previous question. The whole point of looking at a river, I mean, as a symbolic space, a symbolic free flowing territory, is because it undercuts or deconstructs any attempt to classify, any attempt to quantify, all right, any attempt to put a number or a figure to it. So I think what we should be doing in memory studies, and this is something which is interestingly coming from neuroscience as well. So if you read Eric Kandel, for example, he's talking about Spinoza, Damasio, and this is a book that I recommend very, very heavily. Antonio Damasio has actually got 2 books on philosophy. I mean, he's going to get a Nobel Prize in neuroscience very soon. I mean, Kandel is already a Nobel laureate, but Damasio will get a Nobel Prize very soon in neuroscience. He's one of the most respected neuroscientists today working on memory. Now, he has 2 books in philosophy. One is called Descartes' Error. It is actually a very anti-Cartesian take on knowledge. So he's sort of critiquing the mind-body dualism, he's critiquing this enlightenment logic about quantifiability, etc. And the second book, which is an extension of that, I believe, is something called Looking for Spinoza. And it's going back to the philosophy of Spinoza in terms of what I just used, in terms of using the concept of asymmetric entanglement, the monism of Spinoza against the dualism of Descartes, right? So the whole idea of looking at experience as an embodied phenomenon, as an asymmetric phenomenon. So language, religion, race, these become very asymmetrically mixed in terms of human experience. So what becomes interesting, what becomes important in the end is experientiality, or the experience of experientiality, what is called metacognition in neuroscience. So metacognition becomes a very important tool in memory studies today. The experience of experience that you can't put a finger on, can't put a number on. And in terms of looking at language, in terms of looking at religion, these become different markers of identity. But none of these markers override one another in terms of any political event. And the whole idea of literature and the whole idea of memory studies essentially is, in a way, a celebration of messiness, a celebration of something which leaks out. And I use the word messiness and leaking out, again, from cognitive theory, from cognitive studies. So we have people like Andy Clark, people like David Herman, who look at cognition as essentially a process of leaking out. So self is leaking out into the environment in a way that all these parameters become very asymmetrically combined: language, religion, range, etc. So this asymmetric entanglement of individuality, of experientiality, produces the very healthy and celebratory messiness in memory studies, something which we celebrate in this particular field. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. I thank again the organizers for inviting me to the session, and I'm very happy to engage in emails about this discussion. Thank you. Stay safe. Yeah, sure. It is just my name. You can Google me up. It should show up. It is just my name at itm.ac.in. I mean, if you Google me up, it should show up. It should show up. Thank you. Thank you very much. Take care. Stay safe, everyone. Thank you.